Welcome, dear listener. You've done enough for today. You've carried the weight of hours and thoughts, and you are safe now. Nothing is asked of you here, nothing but rest and the quiet comfort of story. Tonight I'm going to tell you one of the greatest love stories ever carried through the centuries. The story of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the brilliant, restless composer who dared to defy kings and emperors, who lived not for wealth or status, but for music and freedom. And Constanze, the woman who saw him not as the world did, but as he truly was. His greatest believer, his fiercest defender, the one who stood beside him when the world turned its back, the one who carried his legacy when he could go no further. Before you settle in, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel and tell me where in the world you're listening from. The world feels a little smaller when we're all connected by love. Let us begin. It's the year 1781, and in the heart of Europe, a city stands at the height of its power. Vienna, the glittering capital of the Habsburg Empire, a place where chandeliers burn through the night, where powdered wigs and velvet gowns sweep through mirrored halls, where music itself is currency, bought, sold, and played like a game for kings. This is the stage where reputations rise and fall, where artists are measured not by genius, but by patronage, where a single nobleman's favor can make or break a life's work. Here, behind palace walls and in candlelit salons, the mighty gather to be seen, to be entertained, to remind the world that they hold the keys to power. And in their hands, music becomes a weapon, a prize, a servant to the throne. But tonight, among the rattling carriages and flickering lanterns of this restless city, another figure walks the streets. Not a prince, not a court favorite, not a man with power to command the palace doors to open. Just a young composer, carrying nothing but a satchel of worn sheet music and a dream that will not die. His name is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Once the courts of Europe had called him a miracle, a child prodigy who played for kings and dazzled empresses before he was even tall enough to reach the pedals of a piano. But Vienna has a short memory, and the boy who once filled its gilded halls with wonder has returned a man, unclaimed, unprotected, uninvited. No court awaits him now. No patron holds out a hand. He has walked away from the security of noble service. He has defied the system that made him, and in doing so, he has set himself on a path no one dares to walk. A life without title, without protection, without permission. He dares to believe that genius can stand on its own. He believes that music belongs not to kings, but to the world. He dares to live as the first true independent artist in a city built to crush men like him. And though he does not yet know it, he is about to meet the one person who will make that impossible dream her life's mission. The woman who will see him when no one else does. The woman who will carry his name when he no longer can. The carriage wheels fall silent on the icy street. He steps down alone. No footman calls his name. No crowd gathers at the gate. Vienna does not pause to notice his return. The city hums as it always has, restless, glittering, indifferent. Carriages rattle past him without slowing. The palace windows glow high above the street, their gold-framed curtains drawn tight against the winter air. Mozart pulls his coat tighter around his shoulders. He had imagined it differently. He had imagined a city waiting to hear him again, a city that would remember the boy who once played for emperors, the young man who dared to leave the archbishop's service and build something greater on his own. But the streets are silent to him now. He had grown up in Salzburg, a German-speaking city, on the edge of the Austrian Empire. And though Vienna spoke his language, it had never truly felt like home. He was German by blood, but in this city, where aristocracy ruled every corner, he still stood apart. Vienna belongs to other names, safer names, men who bow when they are told, men who play what the court expects to hear. He finds lodging in a narrow room near the city's edge, a cold, drafty space with thin walls and a window that refuses to shut properly. He spends his days chasing small work where he can find it, teaching the daughters of men who barely remember why they hired him in the first place. Once, the emperor himself had offered him a commission, the abduction from the Seraglio, a triumph, they had called it, a moment that should have opened every door. But Joseph II, like all powerful men, had other distractions. The applause had faded quickly. The invitations had stopped coming. Mozart plays to half-filled rooms, writes music that no one will pay to publish, smiles politely to patrons who have already chosen someone else. And when the innkeeper comes to collect what he cannot afford to pay, Mozart is left standing in the snow, clutching the last of his belongings, wondering how far a man can fall before the city swallows him whole. He looks up at the glowing palace windows one last time, then turns away. He knows only one door that might still open for him now, and though pride burns like a stone in his throat, he has no choice but to try. The streets feel different when you have nowhere to go. The same stones beneath his boots, the same frozen air, curling through the narrow alleys, but the city feels heavier now, smaller, meaner. He walks without purpose at first, past shuttered bakeries, past taverns spilling smoke and song, past the golden-lit houses, where men who play the game more carefully than he doze in comfort by roaring fires. He should turn toward the city gates, toward Salzburg, toward the life he left behind. But Mozart has never been good at turning back. Instead, his feet carry him to a street he promised himself he'd never see again. Above a tavern where the smell of old ale clings to the walls like smoke, to a crooked green door that hasn't changed in years. The last time he stood here, it had been for Aloysia. She had been the star then, bright, beautiful, full of promise. He had written for her, played for her, even dared to ask for her hand. She had turned him down, gently but firmly, choosing her future over the risk of tying herself to a man with no fortune. He had left, humiliated, swearing never to come back. But pride feels smaller when your hands are empty and your pockets colder than the wind. The Webers had always taken in boarders, musicians, travelers, men in need of a place to land. He tells himself that's all this is, just a place to land, nothing more. With a deep breath, he lifts his hand and knocks. The door creaks open, more quickly than he expects. And there she is, Constanze. Not Aloysia, the sister he had once chased so foolishly. Constanze, the quiet one, the one who had always lingered just outside the edge of the spotlight. She had grown up here, raised in the shadow of Vienna's golden halls, a German, Austrian girl, born to a family of musicians who had learned to survive without the court's favor. Not nobility, not anyone's prize, but something steadier, something real. She doesn't ask why he's here. She doesn't ask what he needs. She already knows. For a moment, their eyes hold longer than they should, and something passes between them. Not recognition exactly, not memory. Something quieter, something easier to feel than explain. She steps back, giving him room to enter. No questions, no judgment, just space. The apartment smelled the same. Boiled cabbage, burning wood, bread left to rise on the hearth. Frau sat near the fire, her needle flashing in the low light. And across the room, just visiting, no longer living here, but never fully gone, Aloysia sat by the small keyboard, turning the pages of a score. She looked up when he entered, polite, reserved, the past between them hanging there, unspoken. Constanze stood by the door, silent but steady, the only one who seemed to offer him a place to belong. It is Constanze who moves first, gesturing toward the back hallway, where the rented rooms sit waiting. Without a word, Mozart crosses the room, past the family who once knew him as a guest, past the woman who had once turned him away, toward the only place in Vienna that hasn't locked him out. The door closes softly behind him, and for now, that is enough. He is met next by Frau, the mother of the house, practical, brisk, but not unkind. She had been renting rooms to musicians for years now, ever since her husband passed, leaving her to care for 4 daughters on her own. The little apartment above the tavern had become a resting place for travelers, singers, and players who needed nothing more than a roof and a meal between engagements. Mozart had once been one of them, though the stakes had felt different then. And yet, she welcomes him back without fuss or question. No mention of the past. No reminder of the way things had ended before. She simply clears the same small room at the back of the apartment and tells him it's his again if he wants it. And so, without ceremony, he settles back into the quiet corners of the Weber household. At first, it feels like nothing more than a business arrangement. He pays what little he can. He comes and goes without disturbing the family's routines. Most days, he walks across the city to tutor the children of Vienna's merchant and noble families, teaching them how to play sonatas and scales, taking what small payments their parents are willing to give. In the evenings, he performs in private homes, small gatherings of polite society where music is little more than background noise for the wealthy guests who barely look up from their wine. He spends hours at his desk, writing music no one has asked for yet. Symphonies, quartets, piano works. Pieces he hopes will one day fill Vienna's grand stages, though he has no patron, no publisher, no guarantee they will ever be heard. It is work, it is survival, but it is not yet a life. And still, he stays. As the days stretch into weeks, and the weeks into something longer, the edges begin to blur. He stays longer than any guest usually does. Far longer than any unmarried man is expected to stay in a house full of women. And Vienna begins to notice. Gossip, soft at first, begins to slip through the city's quieter corners. Is he living there? With the Webers? With the sister? Not Aloysia, but the other one, the quiet one. In a city obsessed with appearances, it doesn't take much for rumors to take on a life of their own. And yet, for all the talk outside those walls, inside, life goes on almost unchanged. Frau keeps the household moving. Aloysia keeps her distance. And Constanze is simply there. Always there. A quiet presence that feels harder and harder to ignore. As the weeks slipped by, the distance between them disappeared. It happened slowly at first, in quiet moments, shared space, unspoken understanding. She would sit near the window while he worked, watching him draft notes and copy pages by candlelight, her presence steady as the hours stretched deep into the night. They talked more often now, about the city, about the music, about what it meant to be seen and yet overlooked. She became the only one who understood what the silence between his failures truly felt like. And somehow, without either of them daring to say it, he became the only one who made her feel truly noticed. The walls grew thinner with each passing night, the rooms smaller, the air heavier, and when the lights went out, neither of them seemed willing to part. One night, long after the house had gone still, they found themselves tangled in quiet laughter, shoulders brushing, fingers drifting, breath catching in the narrow space between. And for the first time, they didn't stop themselves. It was not a kiss that ruined them, not a glance or a whispered word. It was the way they gave in, completely, without fear, as though the rest of the world had already fallen away. And when Frau opened the door, when she saw them there, wrapped in the kind of closeness no mother could ignore, the quiet, fragile world they had built came crashing down. She didn't scream. She didn't scold. She simply closed the door again and left the weight of what had happened hanging in the air between them. The next morning, her voice was cold and certain. It's time you made it right. By morning, the house had gone silent. Constanze moved through the kitchen without meeting his eye, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Frau did not speak again. She didn't need to. The words had already been spoken. It's time you made it right. And Mozart knew exactly what that meant. It had nothing to do with love, or timing, or whether they were ready. It meant marriage. It meant standing before the world and claiming what could no longer be hidden. It meant offering his name, his future, his promise to a woman who had already given him more than he dared to admit. It meant making her his, or leaving her to carry the shame alone. And that he could not do. Vienna was already beginning to whisper. Mozart could feel it in the way strangers glanced his way, in the way old acquaintances smiled too tightly, as if they already knew what was expected of him now. And for the first time he felt fear. Not of scandal, not of the city's sharp tongue, but of what marriage might cost him. He had spent his life refusing to be owned. No court, no patron, no man's favor. To bind himself now, to take on a family when he could barely care for himself, felt like stepping back into chains he had fought so long to break. He wrote to his father in Salzburg, told him everything, or at least enough to make Leopold understand the choice now standing in front of him. And the reply came swiftly. No. Mozart read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. He already knew what it would say. Leopold had other plans for his son. Better matches. Safer matches. Not a boarding house girl. Not a woman with no dowry. Not someone who could offer him anything but her heart. And yet, when Mozart looked at Constanze across the table that night, when she finally dared to lift her eyes and meet his again, he knew what he had already chosen. They didn't make an announcement. There were no grand declarations, no celebration, no blessing from Salzburg. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a moment and more like surrender to something that had already become inevitable. Mozart stayed, and Constanze let him. What had begun as a practical arrangement had become something else entirely. What once felt like risk had become comfort. Not ease, not safety, but the quiet comfort of knowing they had somehow become each other's only certainty. Still, Vienna demanded the formality. And so, on the 4th of August in the year 1782, they were married. Not in secret, but in simplicity, in the heart of the city that had tried so many times to shut them out. St. Stephen's Cathedral, the towering stone heart of Vienna. They married without guests, without Mozart's father, without fortune or title or royal favor. But when Mozart took her hand, and she took his name, they carried something no contract or blessing could give them. They had each other, and they had chosen this life, whatever it might cost. They moved into a small borrowed apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much. Bare floors, second-hand furniture, windows that barely kept out the winter wind. They moved again the following year, and again after that. No home lasted long. No success felt permanent. But they built something together. Constanze became more than a wife. She became his partner in every sense. She helped him manage students and organize concerts. She copied his music by hand when they couldn't afford to hire a professional scribe. She stood at his side when no court or patron claimed him. He was becoming something Vienna had never seen before, a composer who answered to no master but himself. Mozart had walked away from the safety of noble service, and Constanze, she had chosen to walk with him. Their first child, Raymond Leopold, was born the following summer, a boy with bright eyes and a strong cry. For a moment, it seemed like their life had begun to settle, like they had found something lasting. But fate, as it often did with Mozart, had other plans. Little Raymond died before his first birthday, and the quiet in their home grew heavier than music could fill. Even so, Constanze stayed. She always stayed. Marriage had not solved their problems. If anything, it had only made them harder to ignore. Mozart had walked away from security, from Salzburg, from the archbishop who had once paid his salary, from the courts that had once called him a miracle. He had walked away because he believed, deep in his restless, stubborn heart, that there had to be another way to live, another way to create, another way to survive. But Vienna had never been kind to men who stood alone. In this city, music belonged to power, to emperors, to dukes, to noble houses that paid composers to write on command. A man without a patron was not a master of his own fate. He was a curiosity, an amusement, a risk most people were not willing to take. No one built a career without bowing first, and yet that was exactly what Mozart dared to do. He filled his days with students, children of merchants and minor nobles who barely remembered his name. He played in back rooms and candlelit salons, where laughter often drowned out the music. He wrote feverishly, symphonies, sonatas, operas, knowing that no patron had asked for them, knowing that no salary was waiting. But he couldn't stop. Something in him still believed that the work could stand on its own, that the music itself was enough. Constanze stood with him through it all. She managed their little household as best she could. She copied his manuscripts by hand when they couldn't afford to hire a professional scribe. She helped him organize performances, reached out to publishers, and stayed at his side when most would have walked away. She never promised him fortune. She never pretended to have the answers. But every day, she stood beside him, not because she had to, but because she believed in what they were building together. A life without permission. It was reckless. It was fragile. It was nothing the world around them had ever seen. But it was theirs, and they held on to it with everything they had. For a little while, it worked. Against every expectation, Mozart had done what no one believed possible. He had built a career without a patron, without a court, without bowing to anyone. And for a time, Vienna listened. In the year 1784, he dared something few had ever tried. He rented out concert halls, sold tickets to the public, and invited the city to hear his music. Not in palace chambers or noble salons, but in rooms filled with merchants, craftsmen, and curious townspeople. These subscription concerts were a risk, but they were a triumph. People came. Not just aristocrats, but ordinary Viennese, men and women who had never stepped inside a royal court. Night after night, they filled the seats to hear the young composer who had once been forgotten, now standing on his own. His piano concertos lit up the city. His name returned to the lips of patrons who had once looked past him. For a season, Mozart was Vienna's favorite again. And through it all, Constanze stood just beyond the edge of the light. She managed the bookings, the household, the tangled mess of Mozart's unfinished pages. She copied his music by hand, arranged his schedule, cheered him on from the wings. It was everything they had dared to hope for. Not wealth, not comfort, but life on their own terms. But Vienna's affection never stayed long. By 1786, the fashionable crowds began to move on. The subscription concerts that had once filled every seat grew quieter, the applause thinner, the money slower. Mozart answered by taking a bold step forward. He began working with the court theatre again, producing an opera that had already stirred whispers before the curtain ever rose. The Marriage of Figaro. It premiered in Vienna that spring. The music was brilliant, daring, alive with something sharper than court audiences were used to hearing. It was met with polite success, but nothing like the triumph he had hoped for. Then came the invitation from Prague. He took the opera there, to a city that had never carried the weight of Vienna's politics, and they welcomed him like a king. Prague fell in love with the music, and with him. For a brief, shining moment, Mozart tasted the kind of success that felt pure, unforced, real. But the money from Prague couldn't hold back the tide forever. Back in Vienna, the debts were beginning to mount. Mozart and Constanze had moved to a larger apartment during the height of his success, a place that cost more than they could safely afford. The image of success had its own price, and as the city's attention shifted again, the reality of their situation grew harder to ignore. And as if the strain weren't enough, Constanze's health began to fail. No one knew exactly what had taken hold of her, only that the color left her cheeks, the laughter left her voice, and the strength that had carried them both seemed to slip further away with each passing week. Mozart, desperate to help, sent her to the spa town of Baden, hoping that rest, fresh air, and the healing waters might bring her back to him. And for the first time in years, their little apartment felt unbearably empty. The city outside kept moving, but inside, The silence pressed in on him like a weight he could not shake. He kept working. He had to. He kept writing, planning, hoping for another chance. But the truth was hard to ignore. Vienna, for all its glitter and promise, had already turned its back once more. And Mozart, for all his genius, was running out of time. Constanze returned to him in the autumn of 1791. Weaker than before, but alive. The color had not fully returned to her cheeks, and her laughter still sounded like an echo of what it once was. But she had come back, and with her return, so did the fire in him that Vienna had nearly beaten to ash. He knew he couldn't chase the court's favor anymore. He couldn't fill palaces with music the way other men did. Men who knew how to bow. Men who knew how to wait for permission. But there were other places, other stages, other people who had not yet stopped listening. And when Emanuel Schikaneder, an old friend and fellow Freemason, offered Mozart a chance to write something different, something wild, something for the people, Mozart said yes. The Magic Flute. A fairy tale on the surface, but underneath, a story filled with the secret symbols of their brotherhood, a celebration of truth, of courage, of the freedom to stand on one's own. It would not premiere in the Emperor's palace. It would not be paid for by noble hands. It would rise from the floorboards of Schikaneder's small, bustling theater, performed by actors and singers who lived paycheck to paycheck, for an audience of merchants, bakers, students, and working men. And Mozart poured everything he had left into it. Constanze stood beside him every step of the way, managing the household, copying the scores, helping him bring the impossible to life, one page at a time. They knew it was a gamble. They knew Vienna might ignore it, or worse, laugh at it. But for once, the stakes didn't matter. All that mattered was the music, and the chance to give it to the world, not just to the powerful, but to everyone. On the night the Magic Flute premiered, Mozart stood behind the curtain with his heart pounding louder than the orchestra tuning in the pit. The theater was nothing like the golden halls of the palace. No velvet-lined balconies, no chandeliers dripping with crystal, just bare wooden beams, crowded benches, and a stage barely large enough to hold the players. But it was full, packed with faces from every corner of the city, not nobles, not courtiers, but ordinary people, craftsmen, merchants, bakers, students, the very heartbeat of Vienna. He glanced toward Constanze, standing in the shadows, her face pale but steady. She had carried him through every closed door, every empty hall, every whispered failure. And now she stood beside him again, as they waited for the curtain to rise on one last great gamble. The music that followed was like nothing the city had heard before. Strange, playful, filled with secret meaning for those who dared to look beneath the surface. The laughter came first, then the silence, then the wonder. By the final chorus, the theater shook with applause. For a moment, it felt like they had won. But behind the cheers, Mozart knew the truth. The theater took most of the profits. The debt still hung over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. Success, as always, came with a cost they could never quite outrun. Then came the commission. A stranger, cloaked and silent, appeared at their door. He carried an offer, a request for a requiem mass, paid in advance, but no name given. The work was to be delivered in secret. Mozart took the payment, but the request haunted him. He told Constanze it felt like he was writing his own funeral. His health began to fail soon after. The fever came first, then the aching limbs, the weakness that no sleep could cure. Constanze, terrified, begged him to stop, to rest. She sent him to Baden once again, hoping the waters and the quiet might bring him back to her. For a few weeks, he stayed away, but the unfinished requiem pulled at him like a ghost. He returned to Vienna before winter fell, determined to finish what he had begun. Despite his illness, he continued to appear at the magic flute, slipping into the back of the theatre to hear the music rise once more. On the 30th of November, just days before the end, he attended for the last time, smiling, laughing softly with friends, as if the shadows had not already begun to gather. And still, he worked. He had to. The requiem, unfinished, still waited on the desk by his bed. And time was slipping away. In the final days of November, the fever tightened its grip. Mozart could barely stand, barely speak, but his mind refused to let go. The requiem sat open on the table beside his bed, pages scattered, notes half finished, voices only he could hear. Constanze tried to take the work away. She begged him to rest, to let the music wait. But he only shook his head, whispering the same thing again and again. I must finish it, for myself. When his strength failed him, he called for Franz Süssmayr, his trusted student and copyist. Together, they worked late into the night. Mozart dictating the melodies he could no longer write with his own hand, Süssmayr carefully capturing every word, every note, as if they could hold back the inevitable for just a little longer. Mozart believed, even to the end, that if he could finish it, he might live to hear it played. But the notes outlived him. In the early hours of the 5th of December, 1791, with Constanze at his side, Mozart's breathing slowed. His voice fell silent, and quietly, without fanfare or farewell, he slipped from the world. Vienna did not pause to mourn. No royal procession followed his coffin. No musicians lined the streets to honor his passing. No monument rose above his grave. He was buried in a common grave at St. Mark's Cemetery, in keeping with the city's laws for men of his status. No stone marked the spot. No ceremony filled the air with music. The sky, some said, turned dark that morning, the wind rising cold and sharp as they lowered him into the earth. Constanze stood alone at the gates, watching until the last carriage rolled away. She returned to their empty apartment with more than grief on her shoulders. She returned with debts to settle, unfinished music to protect, and a choice to make. Let his story end here, or carry it forward, with everything she had left. The city moved on, as it always had, as it always would. Mozart was gone, and with him, the fragile income that had kept their little world from falling apart. The debts remained, more than Constanze could count, more than any widow without title or fortune could possibly repay. She might have given in, might have disappeared into the quiet shame the city expected, but that was never who she was. She had stood beside him in life, and she would not let his name vanish in death. The requiem, unfinished, uncertain, tangled in secret commissions and legal doubts, became her first battle. She worked with Franz Süssmayr, urging him to complete the piece exactly as Mozart had intended. She sold the finished manuscript to the patron who had paid for it, but she made copies too. Silent, careful copies that she would one day use to tell the world that this music, this genius, was her husband's alone. She began organizing concerts of his works, selling manuscripts, negotiating with publishers, challenging anyone who tried to claim credit for what Mozart had left behind. And when the debts threatened to swallow her whole, she remarried, not for love, but for survival. Her second husband, Georg Nikolaus von Nissen, was a diplomat, a man who believed in Mozart's greatness as much as she did. Together, they published the first biography of Mozart's life, the first true account of the man behind the music. Constanze spent the rest of her years telling his story, fighting for his name, carrying the memory of the man Vienna had once tried to forget. And in the end, the world remembered. The boy who had once played for emperors, the man who had dared to stand without a patron, the husband who had risked everything to build a life on his own terms, he lives still. In every concert hall, in every whispered note, in every heart that still carries his music. And it was she, not the court, but Constanze, who carried his name across the centuries, the first independent artist, and the woman who made sure the world would never forget him. And so, dear listener, as you lay here now, your eyes growing heavy, your breath soft and slow, know that you, too, carry the legacy of what they built. You live in a world where music is free, where art can stand on its own, where genius no longer waits for permission to be heard. Because once, in a city of locked gates and silent rooms, there was a man who dared to believe that music belonged to everyone, not just to kings, and there was a woman who believed in him when the world did not. Mozart and Constanze, two hearts, two names, forever intertwined in the music that still plays, long after the lights have dimmed. So rest easy now, dear listener, and let the music carry you, just as it carried them, into history.